Jørgen, tak så mycket. Det er fantastisk godt at være her, og jeg bor i København. Jeg beklager, jeg prater ikke svensk, men jeg taler udmærket dansk. I mange år, men jeg var født i USA. Og det er vigtigt, fordi hver gang jeg har haft forretningsmøder i Sverige med danske forretningsfolk, der er altid en, der siger, og vi må hellere tale engelsk for Eriks skyld. See, the Danes like to think that they speak all kinds of languages, but they don't. In fact, the Swedes are much better at understanding Danish than the Danes are at understanding Swedish. So I apologize for my countrymen. Oh Christ, it's recording. So this is going out. So I'll do this in English. I'm really honored to be here today. This is the first World IA Day, and in fact, this morning at 5 in the morning, I learned why we are doing it today. And Jørgen didn't know. I didn't know either, but now I know. This is the 14th anniversary of the initial publication of the Polar Bear book. Now, does anyone here not know what the Polar Bear book is? Far too many people, right. It's all the people who are doing technical information architecture. There was a book that was published by Lou Rosenfeld, who is in Bogota, Colombia, speaking today, and Peter Morville, who is, I don't know where he's speaking today, Ann Arbor maybe. They wrote a book called Information Architecture for the World Wide Web. They are librarians. They took kind of a new view of what information architecture was, rather than sort of database design and the more traditional uses of the term. They said, look, you know, we're looking at structuring information in an interactive environment. In this case, it was primarily websites, and it was how do you do a sitemap. So this was back in 1998, and it was Amazon's best-selling book of the year, which says quite a lot for both the book, but also for Amazon's rather strange marketing policy back in 1998. Anyway, that's why we're here. I wrote the second book on information architecture. I came from the business side of things. I wasn't a librarian, but I've made a career of telling people how they should organize things so that it makes sense and creates value and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it does create value, sometimes it doesn't. Then we learn from that. Looking at the program today, there are a lot of really high-powered, hardcore presentations, and you're going to learn a lot of really, really interesting stuff, I think. Probably the one speech that is going to have the least takeaway for you guys is mine. And the reason for this is I just want to share some of the thoughts that I've had over the past year in terms of where I think our industry is going and some of the things that we need to be thinking about as information architects. And here I'm not thinking about librarians or technicians or businessmen, but just all of us who are involved in designing stuff that's being used by other people. How are we going to make the world a better place? How are we going to do our jobs better? And so there's not a lot of like hardcore, ooh, I better write that down and remember to do that on Monday when I get back to work. I don't have a lot of that kind of stuff in this talk. As a matter of fact, I only have one slide in this talk, and that's it. I'm kind of tired of PowerPoint presentations. And so I decided instead that I would do this on my whiteboard. And it's kind of a trick to figure out how you get a whiteboard into PowerPoint, but it can be done. It can be done. And I want to start by talking a little bit about innovation. Now, innovation is one of those words that is bandied about by all businesses these days. I looked in the Danish business newspaper, Børsen. It's one of these pink newspapers with business information and stock quotes and so on. Every day this week there has been an article about innovation, or at least an article that mentioned innovation. And the interesting thing is, if you actually go out and ask somebody, well, so what is innovation? They'll come up with some completely screwball explanation. Well, it's something new. It's a new idea. It's a new thing. And it's not a new thing. Innovation is about solving a problem. And if you do not solve a problem, you're going to create one. Innovation is a planned activity. It's not like invention that can just happen by accident. And so when we talk about we're going to have innovation centers, and say, right, that's not really an innovation center. That's a best practice center. That's something very different. Innovation is interesting, and it's violently important to what we are doing as technologists. And I think that we do need to understand the further ramifications of innovation. And there's a story that Bill Buxton, who's a researcher, senior researcher from Microsoft, he used to tell it until I told it so many times that people actually think it's my story. It isn't. It's Bill Buxton's story, but, well, he's not here and I am, so. He says something very important. He said, anytime you innovate, anytime you try to solve a problem, there will be three types of consequences. There will be technological consequences, political consequences, social consequences, and technological consequences of whatever you do. So here's the story. If we roll the clock back about 150 years, the British Army, or the Brits, had pretty much conquered half the world. This is where the expression, the sun never sits on the British Empire, sets on the British. I'm breaking in some teeth for a friend. The sun never sets on the British Empire. They were in China, they were in India, they were all over the place. Now, the British Army discovered a problem. At this time, they were using what were known as muzzle-loaded muskets. Now, a musket is a gun, rifle, okay? And they're big and they're long. And the way, and the muzzle, that's the top. That's where the bullet comes out. So the way you use one of these things is you take it, and then you have your powder, and you put some powder in, and then you have this really long rod that you stick down to tamp it into place. And then you take your mini ball out, your bullet, and you put that in, and you tamp that down, and then you take some cotton or something else just to hold the whole thing in place so that the bullet doesn't roll out when you lift up this gun. And then you cock the flint, and you lift it up, and you shoot. That's how it works. Let me ask you a question. Why would you ever want to fire a second shot on a field of battle?
Because I miss.
And what are the consequences of your having missed?
Well, I might die.
Because somebody is going to shoot back at you.
Yeah.
Right. So, with this in mind, what is the very last thing we want to be doing on a battlefield with people shooting at us? And that's standing up and pouring in powder and tamping it down. This is a really slow process. So, the British Army went to the Lee Enfield Company. They made rifles and said, look, we want a breech-loading rifle. The breech, that's where the hammer and the trigger and all of that, that's the breech. We want a breech-loading rifle. Fix that. So the Lee Enfield people said, great, a chance for a technological innovation. So they thought about this, and they came up with a really great solution. And it was, they had pre-measured the gunpowder in little greased packets, really easy to take up, put it in your mouth, tear it off, pour it in the breech, put in a bullet, cock the gun, fire. And you can do this while you're lying down. Not bad. Okay, so that's the technological innovation. But there are also political and social sides to this. Who were the British fighting alongside and against in the 1840s and the 1850s? They were in the Middle East. They were in Afghanistan. They were in India. So their allies, the people that were helping them, the locals, were Muslims and Hindus. What's the one thing you don't want anywhere near your mouth if you were a Muslim or a Hindu?
Pork.
Pork?
Grease.
Exactly. How do you think the Lee Enfield people had greased these little packets? They were using animal fat. There were revolutions, mutinies along all the fronts, from Iraq to Afghanistan to India. The Brits almost lost the jewel in the crown, India, 100 years before Gandhi came along. So we have both social and political aspects of this innovation. And so whenever we do anything, whenever somebody says, we need an app that's going to do whatever, think this through, because there are going to be three sides to it. And some of them may not be as good as some enthusiastic marketer thinks it is. And I beg you to keep these things in mind. Now, this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this last year, trying to figure out where our industry is going. So it dawned on me, of course, everybody's talking about Steve Jobs these days. And Steve started out being a technological innovator, but absolutely became very, very political at the end. And had a lot of sway, both with politicians, Kofi Annan, Bill Clinton, and so on. I said, well, great. So what innovators could there be that went the other way? They started out as political innovators and then became technological innovators. And the name I came up with was Joseph Stalin. Now you're probably going to say, is he fucking kidding? Steve Jobs and Joseph Stalin? You can't talk about them at World Usability Day? Well, I'm going to, and I want to explain how this works. Now, if we look at Jobs, he did several very, very interesting things. He always believed in a closed system. This is why he never got along with Bill Gates, because Bill opened up the code. He said, right, I'll license DOS to you. I'll let you use our code. Very democratic system. Steve Jobs, that's a very closed loop. Anybody who's ever tried to hack a Mac knows how tricky that is, as opposed to whatever you're going to do with your PC. iTunes, brilliant idea. You're listening to something in the shower, and then you can go into the website for the radio station, and you just click the button, and you get to download the tune for 4 kroner, 5 kroner, and the next time you plug in your iPad or your iPod or your iPhone, your whatever, it's going to work, and you're going to get this music. This is a very, very closed, very specific system. If we go back to the very first Macintosh in 1983, actually this started with the Lisa, which was somewhat earlier, and I actually had a Lisa. Ha! Sorry I sold it, because it's worth a fortune now. Nobody has a Lisa. The interesting thing about the Lisa and then later the Macintosh was it was missing something vitally important, something that every computer programmer in the world expected to find on a computer keyboard. Does anyone know what those are? The cursor keys. Why do these machines not have cursor keys? Because this is Steve Jobs saying, I have got to get people to get used to the idea of using a mouse. We've got to get them away from the keyboard and over to the mouse. And he did this very effectively. And then 10 years later, we have the iMac, and the iMac comes along, and by the way, this is before we had USB drives, had no disk drive. The only way to get information in or out of this machine was either it was on a CD or you were using the internet. And I think Jobs, more than anyone else, managed to further technology on the internet. The iMac was a very interesting product, and it certainly got a lot of people online because they had to be online, otherwise it didn't work. So we have technological innovations that actually become very social and then ultimately political. If we turn this around and look at Joseph Stalin, Joseph Stalin is arguably the greatest mass murderer in the history of the world. And if you count up how many millions he killed, I mean, Hitler is nothing in comparison. Stalin did something very interesting. Back in 1929, he was interested in producing or encouraging people to do collective farming. Now, collective farming means that every farm is given a quota. This is how much they need to produce. It's going to be sent to the cities where people are producing other things that will then be sent out to the farms. And then whatever's left over, the farmers get to keep, and that's how they stay alive. But they have to contribute to the greater good of the Soviet Union. This is 1929. Now, the problem is that the Ukraine has never really cared for Russia very much. And even though they were part of the Soviet Union at that point, there's never been any great love between the Ukrainians and the people to the north. There were a lot of Ukrainian nationalists, and they saw collective farming as certainly a way to make waves for Joseph Stalin. So Joseph Stalin did something very interesting. He simply upped the quotas that the farms had to produce that would be sent to the cities. The result being that there was no food left for the farmers. And during the years 1931 and 32, about 8 million Ukrainians starved to death. That's a lot of people. That's the first time starvation has been used as a political weapon in that way. And so we're starting with a political thing that then becomes technological, because what happened, he got collective farming. This is also innovation. It's not a very pleasant kind of innovation, but it certainly fulfills the rules in terms of what an innovation is. Innovation is not necessarily always a good thing, and that's why I bring this up. I'm not trying to make Joseph Stalin a hero. I'm certainly not trying to make Stephen Jobs a hero either. He had a lot of bad sides. But it's very interesting to see the way these two have gone in very opposite directions, but cover the range of the three things that I talked about: political, social, and technological. So if we look just for a moment at some of the things that concern us today, that we as information architects should be thinking about, I think at any rate, let's start with the political, social, technological. Politically, there's some interesting things. I'd like to talk about batteries for a minute. I've been asking everybody I know whether they really believe that the iPad does not have flash because it consumes more battery power than HTML5. That was Steve Jobs' argument. I think it was just that he didn't like Adobe. Now, the interesting thing about batteries is that batteries really didn't change very much for many, many years. Back when Edison first started putting together storage batteries, dry cell batteries, for cars, for whatever, they were pretty big. They were pretty bulky. Now, as my wife will tell you, I never throw anything out. So this is a telephone. And you could talk for about 15 minutes before this battery ran out. This is a very big, heavy battery. This is from about 1988. It's really not that far long ago. Now, we've, of course, all seen Wall Street. This is, well, it's a ComNet, but it's a copy of the Motorola brick, as it was called. This is from about 1990. So within the space of 2 years, we've gone from this thing to this thing. That's kind of amazing. Well, 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 well. Let's see what else we've got. Then we've got Motorola, the MicroTac, 1993, much smaller. The StarTAC, even smaller. And of course the Ericsson, which you all know. I figured I had to bring a, well, I guess this is now technically a Japanese telephone, so, well. But the interesting thing was, within very, very few years, this is the Ericsson T whatever, I can't even remember the name of it. What? Thank you. Okay, great. Yeah, because the 68 I've got. See, I've got the 68. See, that had a camera. Oh, pretty neat. Within the space of about 10 years, telephones went from like this to this. And the batteries lasted a really, really long time. Why do I mention this now? Because, of course, we're talking about electric cars. We're talking about all kinds of other innovative things. Why do we want electric cars? Well, they're supposed to be better for the environment. And they probably are. There are fewer CO2 emissions. If you take the whole value chain through, they actually do pretty well in comparison to the whole idea of getting oil out of the ground and refining it and shipping it across the world and turning it into gas and so on. For a gasoline-driven car, it's about 500 grams per kilometer as opposed to 100 grams per kilometer if it's an electric car. So, of course, all of us, because we want a greener world, think that, yes, we should have electric cars. And that also means that people are working really, really hard on battery technology right now to try and figure out how do we make these cars go a little further than, what, the 150-kilometer radius they have right now? They don't really go very far before you have to tank them up again. One of the reasons we're not very happy about that, wasn't that bad, was it?
Don't worry, they won't get out of the building.
One of the reasons that we don't like gasoline is we don't like thinking that we are in the pocket of some nation someplace that has a lot of oil but doesn't respect us, doesn't like us, is controlling the prices artificially. But if you look at the largest supplier of oil to the United States is not Saudi Arabia, it's Canada. See, those Canadians, they're evil. You're evil, all you Canadians. But we have this idea that, no, we want some control, we don't want to be in the pocket of someone. With this in mind, I'd like to remind you that 50% of the lithium carbonate, and that's what we need to make these batteries, is in Bolivia. And the Bolivians don't like the gringos. So are we going to replace one problem with another? We can maybe have a technological solution, but remember, there are going to be social and political aspects to this. Morales doesn't really care for the rest of us very much. He'd rather, be good friends with Fidel and Hugo Chavez and some other people. And these are not people that like us very much. They don't even like the Swedes, and how can you not like the Swedes? It doesn't make any sense. So, batteries. This is a political problem, not just a technological problem. And something that we need to be thinking about when we're designing our apps, when we're working on the kinds of projects that we're going to be facing over the years to come. Because a lot of people are going to be talking about CO2 emissions and carbon offsets and electricity and everything is wonderful. Well, it's not that black and white. So keep that in mind. We have privacy issues. Interestingly enough, Americans have absolutely no concept of privacy. We've got idiots like Mark Zuckerberg that say, well, privacy is so 20th century. We're in the 21st century. We're not entitled to privacy anymore. Everything should be public. Well, we Europeans don't see it that way. In fact, Article 7 of our Constitution for the EU actually has privacy as a right. Nowhere in the American Constitution does it talk about privacy. Americans talk about privacy only when they think that government is going to get on their back. Then they get all huffy and they want to be private. But the truth is, there are a lot of things that are happening right now, and a lot of them are happening in very, very subtle ways. The new Google privacy policy that sort of coordinates things across all kinds of different... we lost a lot of privacy right there. Facebook keeps changing the settings. I think that this is something that we need to think about and we need to worry about. It's not that we should all be paranoid, but every time we design things, and I don't care if you're doing websites or if you're doing hardcore database design, privacy issues are going to come up, and I beg you all to think about this, because the day we stop talking about privacy is the day we no longer have it. I think this is going to be a big problem. And then finally, we see technology used as a weapon. It was very interesting when Twitter was used to organize mobs in Cairo to overthrow Mubarak. Everybody thought, well, it's wonderful that we can use social media and they can get rid of the tyrant. And yet, when there are riots in London, they close down all the services in BlackBerry and whatever. Okay, so this isn't a technological issue, this is a political issue. And so we've got Assad down in Syria who is trying to figure out how the hell to turn off his system. What's good, what's bad? This is not black and white, but these are issues that we need to be thinking about. And so when we praise the Egyptians for the Arab Spring and all this wonderful stuff, and Twitter saved the world. Twitter is a really interesting tool. Twitter really did save the world down in Haiti, and interestingly enough, I was at a very drunken meeting on the Place des United Nations in Geneva with a friend of mine from the Red Cross, and said, I can't get permission to do this, but I'm just going to set up a Twitter avatar and see what happens. That's the way you get things done in an NGO. Don't quote that to anyone. You didn't hear it. I'm so scared as to where this video is going to end up. But the thing is that when Haiti had its earthquake, how did they keep in touch? How did they tell people where medicine and shelter and water was? Through this Twitter avatar from the Red Cross. And now my pal is a hero, and he deserves it. It was a really good idea. But it's not the technology that's good or bad, it's the way it's being used. So that makes it a political decision, and it's something that I really hope that you'll keep in mind. If we move on to the social aspects of things, we're seeing all kinds of really interesting developments in terms of augmented computer-generated, consumer-generated content, user-generated content, augmented reality, augmented translations. Already now, you can find apps that are pretty primitive, but they'll actually listen to a conversation and then you can hear it translated in your ear. It's not very good, but in a couple of years we're going to make this a standard. Already now, we use Google Translate, and it's not perfect, but we at least understand what's happening on a page written in Chinese or Serbo-Croatian or some other language that we don't perhaps know. So a lot of things are happening along this way, and that's going to change the way we interact socially. Certainly my own business has benefited tremendously from this because we really can work across borders. We can share things via Skype. We don't have problems when a report comes from a client in Czech. We can read it at our Danish office. We can run it through Google Translate, and we know what it says, more or less. That's a really good thing. Geo Positioning. 10 years ago, WAP. Does anybody here remember WAP? It was that stack-based kind of HyperCard-ish thing that we had on the early telephones, and WAP was also GPS enabled, except that nobody really used it at that point. And today, of course, everything has some kind of a GPS sender in it. I mean, my car knows where it is, which is interesting because I very rarely know where I am. But the car knows. That's all right, Eric. I know where you're going. So it's very disconcerting. My telephone knows things that I don't know, and I can take a picture, and a year later it will tell me exactly what street corner I was standing on when I took the picture. These are all interesting developments. Now, if we can use them for something other than just mild entertainment, that'll be interesting. I mean, apart from car navigation and some other things, I haven't really seen this being used in a very good way. I think Google Goggles, though, is going to change this. And there's certainly other geo-positioning types of things that we, as information architects, are going to be working on that will make geo-positioning more important and get it outside the range of a novelty and into something that actually produces lasting value for people. Again, though, there's a privacy issue. I'm not sure I want everybody to know where I am all the time. I very much dislike something like Foursquare. How many of you are familiar with Foursquare? For those of you who aren't, it's kind of an add-on to Twitter and other social media where you can log in and say, now I am here. And it's kind of a dangerous thing. I had a friend, a consultant, who was involved in all kinds of interesting projects for big clients. And all of this was protected by NDA, so he was not supposed to be talking about what he was working on. But man, he had Foursquare on, and it was sending out tweets all the time. Hey, I just walked into Saatchi and Saatchi in New York. Like, I'm not sure that your clients want the world to know that you just visited Saatchi and Saatchi in New York. Especially if you're looking for a new agency for them. Their old agency is going to get word of this. So we have to be a little careful about how these things get used. Now, of course, people, they talk about, oh, we're going to get shipped, so we don't even have to have passports, and we don't even have to have keys anymore. I'll just walk up to the door, and it'll automatically open. Interesting thought. Virtual presence. You know, where are we at any given time? That's a really interesting thing. Back in about 1995, there was a fellow by the name of Stoller who wrote a book called Silicon Snake Oil. And he was terribly concerned that, that kids back in 1995 were not being taught social graces because they were completely focused on their computers, video games, or the internet was still pretty new at that point, but they were not interacting socially. Now that model has changed, and we see, for example, with World of Warcraft and other things, that there may be 3 or 4 kids gathered around the same screen, and it becomes a very, very social kind of activity. We didn't know that 15, 16 years ago. But my point is, we're going to see more and more of these kinds of virtual presence things. We're already seeing it through Skype conferencing and other tools that, while primitive, work pretty well. And it's going to be interesting to see where we end up in 5 or 10 years. Does it really matter where we are? I don't know. This is certainly something that's going to cross your desks as information architects. It's something that we're going to have to be thinking about. And the whole idea of interaction over distance and the privacy issues and so on and so forth, these things are all going to be tied together, and we're going to have to say something sensible about that. Finally, we have technology, we have access. The whole idea of ubiquitous Wi-Fi, I think, is incredibly important. I'm looking forward to the day where we have some kind of a Napster-like thing where everybody who has a wireless router in their home can share at least a portion with it to anybody else who's also sharing their router, so I don't have to log in and out and whatever. That also means there's going to be a political and a business change for the telcos. I mean, I just got a message on my phone telling me, hey, welcome to Sweden. It's going to cost you, 16 Danish kroner per megabyte. Christ, Angry Birds updated this morning, and it was 14 megabytes. I'm not going to pay 150 Danish kroner to update fucking Angry Birds. But that's the way the telcos are running things right now, and it's going to have an effect. So I think that access is certainly going to change, and there are going to be new business models. We're going back to dumb terminals. We don't actually need our computer because more and more is becoming cloud-based. But the cloud isn't going to get going until we get ubiquitous Wi-Fi at some reasonable prices. Now, this is not a development that's going to come from North America because the North Americans can drive for 6 days and not see anything but wheat fields. And we drive for 6 hours and we're speaking any one of 20 different languages. And have gone through I don't know how many different telcos. So I think that these kinds of things are going to come from us, and I think that Scandinavia probably has a better chance of doing these things than a lot of others for a couple of reasons. One, we've always been test markets for mobile phones and mobile apps because of Ericsson, because of Nokia. Secondly, we have always thought internationally. I mean, Sweden is a huge country, but it's not a heavily populated country. You have to practice trade with others, just as the Danes have to practice trade, which means that we're more open to the whole idea of roaming in a business sense, not in the technological sense, but in the business sense. We speak more than one language. We don't feel uncomfortable with other cultures, and I think these things are very, very important, and it places us as Scandinavians in a very, very unique position. we have Nearfield Communications. Again, this idea of being chipped and what's going to happen. My passport, for God's sakes, has a chip in it. I've got to find the passport. It's so weird. I've got this damn thing, and I travel enough so that they keep putting in extra pages. It's like this huge book now. But I was amazed when I got it. On the last page, it said, "This document contains sensitive electronics. For best performance," this is what it says, "do not bend, perforate, or expose to extreme temperatures." So, holy God, it's a passport. What did they put in this? And the new EU passports, they have similar chips in it. So certainly Nearfield communication is something that's important. How many of you have traveled through the Copenhagen Airport recently? Quite a few of you. Okay. Have you noticed that it says that the average waiting time to get through security is 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever? You know how they do that? All mobile telephones send out a signal, and all mobile telephones have a unique number. So what they do is they have a system that goes in, and anybody who has a telephone that's turned on in their pocket, when they walk into the area, it starts logging them. And then when you get to the duty-free, it says, okay, he passed through. And they do this with enough telephones, and then they can work out the average waiting time. I'm not making this up. This is the way it works. Now, I mention this because we're back to privacy issues. We're back to virtual presence, geo positioning. All of this stuff is put together. And for goodness sake, there was an information architect that dreamed up the idea of, hey, we know when a mobile phone comes into the system and when it leaves again. This is exactly the kind of thing that we work on, and that's why I mention it today, because I think it's important. And I don't think that we always think about the further consequences of what we do. Sometimes we get so wrapped up with the idea that this is just a really neat idea that we forget that there will be political, social, and technological consequences of what we do. And then finally, the big word today is cross-channel, multi-channel. That's the way it has always been. We have got to stop thinking of websites as these subsidiaries in cyberspace. These are things that are part of a business plan, and there is also an offline contingent. Nothing lives solely on the web or on your phone or in your iPod. We've got to figure out how to make these things share. I need to drive from Copenhagen to the Turning Torso, and I've never been to the Turning Torso before. So I figured, well, I'll go to my computer and I will look it up. Now, cock.dk, which is where I look things up, doesn't know Turning Torso. It's very Danish. And when I finally did, well, then I went to the website for this conference and I found the address and I typed it in, and Cock, a little against its will, finally said, well, all right, I kind of know where it is. It's 23 kilometers, so. Oh wait, you want a map? Now, I could print the map out, but if I'm trying to drive a car, I don't want to be looking at this map, which is kind of unreadable to begin with. How do I get that information over to my phone? I mean, my phone has a navigation system, but what if I wanted to use the other one? Why is it that we can't get something as simple as navigation to work from one unit to another? This is a basic usability problem, and we're going to see more and more of it as we have information stored someplace that we need someplace else. And certainly navigation systems are part of it. We're seeing it with airline tickets. You know, we go through all this rigmarole and we have an electronic ticket. What does that mean? It means we print out a boarding pass. That's an electronic ticket. Now, I can use a QR code at the Copenhagen Airport, but I'll be damned if I'm going to travel out in the world with a QR code, because most of the airports don't know what to do about that. And so suddenly I'm standing who the hell knows where, and it says, you don't have a boarding pass. I said, well, yes I do. It's here. I don't recognize that as a boarding pass. So we have to figure out how to get all these things to go across multi-channel, cross-channel. there's a quote from William Gibson that everybody, I mean, it's almost as popular as Henry Ford's, well, if I'd asked focus groups, they would have told me to build a faster horse. Gibson's is, the future is here already, it's not evenly distributed. So now you've heard it. So it's going to be said 14 times today at least. I think if you Google it, you get more hits than you would if you were Googling Justin Bieber. That's how popular the quote is. But there's another side to this. Back in 1914, George Santayana said, those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. And I think that what we need to be thinking about is combining these two quotes, because for those of us who have the advantage of being at the University of Malmo, where they actually have a program for information architecture, for those of us who are working for companies that truly understand innovation, for those of us who have seen the future, let's figure out how we can share this in a way that others don't have to repeat the mistakes. Because their future is our past. How can we put this together to build a better world? This is why we have conferences like the one we're at today, so that we can share this kind of information and hopefully continue to share the information in the years to come. And then finally, I want to just close with a quote from George Orwell. It's actually from 1984. It's a little creepy, but it's very true. It's those who control the past command the future. And those of us in this room, we have control of the past. And now it's our chance to really command the future. And the question is, for you, ethically, what are you going to do? Are you going to make this a better world, or what's your plan? Talked about Joseph Stalin. I've talked about the politics of Bolivia and a whole lot of stuff that probably isn't on a lot of other information architecture agendas today. But I think it's important. I wanted to share it with you. I hope you can use some of these thoughts and mull them over and see if you can't go out there and build a better world, because that's why we're here. Thank you very much.